For Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Earlier this month, I visited the Penrith Women's Health Centre with my parliamentary colleagues, the Honourable Sophie Cotsis MLC and Shadow Minister for Women, and the members for the Blue Mountains in Londonderry and the newly elected federal member for Lindsay. The Penrith Women's Health Centre is one of 3 services which has lost altogether $250,000 in funding for domestic violence on June 30th this year. They were funded under the former Labor government's domestic violence yellow card early intervention program, which funded counsellors and caseworkers. Managers of Sydney Women's Counselling Service and Cumberland Women's Health Centre have also lost counsellors and caseworkers and were at the meeting to add their voice to the call to reinstate funding. Domestic violence is chronically underreported, as many women do not have anywhere to go and cannot access assistance. These services are an important first point of contact for many women experiencing domestic violence. They provide crucial early intervention to victims and their families with counselling, case management, assistance with housing, health and accessing income support. They work specifically with women who were ineligible for assistance under the government's Staying Home Leaving Violence program, which does not assist women who are still living with their partners. This area of need continues to be yet another gaping hole which still hasn't been met in the government's reforms. Women and their children still living with violent partners desperately need early intervention and assistance navigating the complex pathways to freedom from domestic violence, particularly difficult for those who are experiencing trauma from the violence that they have experienced. All 3 services have made repeated requests to the New South Wales Government to extend their funding, with no response. I myself have written 3 letters of representation to this government, 2 to the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and 1 in conjunction with the Shadow Minister for Women to the Premier himself. However, sadly neither the Premier nor the Minister have bothered to respond to either the services or to myself and the Shadow Minister for Women. With announcements being frequently made on the government's reforms to reduce domestic violence, and the government loudly proclaiming a bipartisan approach to domestic violence, you would think that they would value the thoughts of the community sector, and indeed the opposition. But sadly it appears that in this state, the community, the sector and the opposition are being treated as an accessory after the fact to the devastating cuts which are still happening in the sector. The government admitted earlier this month that it itself did not even know how many refuge beds were available for women and children fleeing domestic violence in this state. And they further, on questioning from myself, admitted that this information was not useful to them and was subject to variances, and they found it too difficult to collect. The ABS can collect this kind of data when they're tracking tourism accommodation, and when I pressed the department on what kind of variances they would be subject to, do they talk about refurbishments to provide better facilities like painting or improving the rooms? No, they gave the excuse that they had to refurbish because there were bed bugs in the rooms, as if to denigrate the most vulnerable women and children in our community who need those services. The government's cuts to early intervention funding and their ignorance at how many beds are provided by refugees shows they don't understand the full complexity of the needs of victims suffering domestic violence. And it also shows a total lack of commitment to providing early intervention and crisis services for victims. The consistent message that I am receiving from workers in this sector, from victims who come into my offices, and I'm sure the offices of all of us in this place, is that accommodation, counselling and support services for victims are what is needed most and what is attracting the least funding. The government should welcome any efforts by the community and the opposition to inform them, but it appears that they are very comfortable in their ivory towers of government, while women and children in this state live on the streets and in their cars to escape violence. It's a disgrace and it's a shame on all of us. The government touts reforms and commitment to stamping out domestic violence, but failing to put money where it's needed most in frontline workers in the area of intervention and providing much needed beds in refuges is failing those women and children. They will continue to live in fear of domestic violence and indeed of their very lives unless the government gets these foundations right. Working with the opposition and the sector and the community is a vital step in this process that the government has failed to take. The Honourable Sophie Cotsis MLC and I have launched a petition calling for reinstatement of this funding, and I urge all members of the community to join us in making this call to government. The Minister must reinstate the funding urgently and indeed extend those services across the state to assist all victims of this terrible crime. Thank you.